My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today and joining us for our book talk, which today we're going to be featuring Robin Williams and her latest book, The Last Romantic War. But before we get started with that, I just want to say a real quick thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museums Foundation for their continued support. They do a great job in supporting the museum for all of our virtual programming, from our book talks to our curator conversations, our trivia nights, our movie discussion nights, and all the other virtual programs that we do. So thank you very much to Miss Jen Carlson and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their support. And then also I would like to say thank you to our sponsor as well, Generac Power Systems. It is awesome to have such a great sponsor on board with us. It not only helps us, it helps the foundation, and it helps everybody out there to receive our free virtual programming. So thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and to Generac Power Systems for their continued support. We greatly appreciate it. And like I said, today we are going to go ahead with a book talk today featuring Mrs. Robin Williams. And she's going to be talking about her latest book, The Last Romantic War, which is a great combination of the World War II home front and also the battlefield perspective as well, as she looked at both avenues through the eyes of her parents, who met just before the war. And I'm not even going to give away anything further than that. I'm going to go ahead and let you talk. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Robin Williams. Robin, thank you for joining us today.
Eric, this is great. Thank you, and thank Jen. And it really is such an honor to be part of a program from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum.
Well, thank you. The floor is all yours, Robin. I'm going to go ahead and stop talking, and I'm going to let you talk about your book.
Okay. Well, before I begin, let me express my thanks and appreciation to the veterans in the audience for your service to America. I always want to thank the families too, who make just as many sacrifices as the veterans themselves. We're so lucky to live here, and we're blessed to have so many wonderful people who have given their time, their talents, their health, and sometimes their lives, that we may continue to live in the greatest, freest country that has ever existed. This is a great country, and the American people are the most generous, open-hearted people on earth. Don't ever doubt that. That goodness is being questioned in some quarters today, but in the 1940s, it was very much accepted as Americans went all over the world to fight the scourge of fascism, socialism, and Marxism. My book takes a look at the lives of that generation of Americans and the sacrifices they made that the civilized world might remain free. The Last Romantic War covers the drama of World War II and the drama and romance of my parents' exotic courtship during the war. They met on a blind date shortly after Pearl Harbor. My dad was the youngest captain in the U.S. Army Infantry and a dashing chap. And my mother was a popular coed, a freshman at Hollins College. My dad proposed that very night, and my mother accepted, but they were a long way from the altar. After a whirlwind courtship, they had a misunderstanding, and Dad went to Burma for 2.5 years. Mom went to work in the war effort and fell in love with a spy, one of ours. The Last Romantic War is the story of how Flo and Bo fell in love at the beginning of the war and then went on their separate ways for the duration, and how in the end, wild horses, burning airplanes, and mixed up train schedules could not keep them apart. But it's also a look at what it was like to live through the war if you were a young American. The book grew out of my love of adventure stories and listening to my dad's stories about being in the jungle in World War II. He served under General Stilwell in the CBI, the China, Burma, India Theater of War. The CBI is the Forgotten Theater. forgotten, that is, by everybody except the loyal children of Lieutenant Colonel Bo Traywick. Most Boomer kids were raised on Iwo Jima, Omaha Beach, Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Bulge. But my brothers and I were raised on the Hukong Valley, the Jambaboom, Michina, and the Irrawaddy River. We heard about leeches, monsoons, and malaria and leeches. We heard a lot about leeches. We thought the biggest part of World War II was fought in Burma. And it always seemed strange that books, movies, and history lessons all focused on Europe or the war in the Pacific, with seldom a word about Burma. And yet, as I was to discover in my research, it was a vast adventure. And for someone like me who was weaned on Tarzan, the Black Stallion, Jack London, Rudyard Kipling, the true life adventure of the Burma Campaign was intoxicating. Burma, as I'm sure you all know, was a British colony, and the Burma Campaign was fought mostly by 1.5 million troops from around the United Kingdom, with only a few American special ops units and 30,000 Chinese troops. I'm sure we didn't hear about the Burma Campaign in this country because you didn't have American troops fighting that campaign. The point of the Burma Campaign was to provide supplies to China and keep China engaged in the war on the side of the Allies. China was at that time surrounded by the Japanese and blockaded, and the only access to the outside world was across North Burma into India. And that access was only by air. I'm sure many of you know the story of flying the hump to take supplies across the lower Himalaya mountains from India to China. Stilwell recruited a dozen or so American officers to go to India and train Chinese troops for the reconquest of Burma. And my father was one of those officers. He spent a year in India training troops and then went into Burma as a liaison for Stilwell and an advisor to the Chinese troops he had trained. Altogether, he spent 2.5 years overseas. His was not the Band of Brothers war experience. He lived among Chinese officers, learned to speak Chinese, ate rice with chopsticks 3 times a day. It was an exotic experience. He rode elephants and camels, ate python meat, socialized with native royalty, and received as gifts a pouch full of jade, 2 samurai swords, among other things. I'm sorry we can't meet in person because I bring a lot of these artifacts along when I speak. Dad carried a plug of opium around with him to barter with the natives. He suffered malaria, survived a hand grenade, hacked his way through bamboo and elephant grass. It was war, you know. He dodged death on numerous occasions. Nearly got killed on a runaway horse and faked his way through a conversation with General Stilwell while suffering a massive hangover. The more I listened to Dad's stories, the more I thought, the grandchildren have to hear about this, even though we didn't have any grandchildren at that point. But when I proposed writing a book about Dad's service in the war and the blind date proposal, both of my parents dismissed the idea. Dad said, I didn't do anything heroic. And Mom said, oh, everybody got married that way. But everybody didn't get married that way. And even without conspicuous heroism, service in Burma was risky, exotic, fascinating. So I recorded 30 hours of my father telling war stories. And I spent 2 years doing research on the war and the Burma Campaign. I went to the National Archives, I went overseas to many of the places where he went: India, Australia, New Zealand, the Middle East, the Burmese border, all of which were part of his world travels. Then I spent years writing and rewriting, trying to find the best way to tell the story, this huge story, to capture the feelings of the main characters and the feel of wartime. It was really overwhelming. I wrote 3 entirely different versions of this book before I ended up with this one. The solution was to listen to the tapes, to listen to my dad telling the story in his own words. My dad was a storyteller. He was always telling anecdotes and stories about his life, often with self-deprecating humor. He told funny stories about growing up in a small town in South Carolina during the Depression. Somehow he made that sound humorous. He told adventure stories about being in Burma during the war. In later years, he joked about all his speeding tickets, especially the ones he got out of. But far and away, his favorite story was how he met and married Flo Neher. We children have heard it so many times we can recite it verbatim. He would start out, "You know, we met on April Fool's Day," as though we hadn't heard that 100 times. And he would launch into the account of meeting her on a blind date and how they agreed that night to get married. He always told the story as though he were seeing her again, sashaying across the parking lot at the Oak Club at Fort Benning. It was the beginning of a love story that he savored for more than 60 years. And he often told it with a touch of wonder that the story ended the same way every time. The hero gets the girl. So, while I set out to document Dad's adventures in Burma, the book evolved, as books do, and became the story that he loved to tell. The story of a great love affair, writ large against the vast backdrop of a global war. Dad, of course, shared his stories with me verbally. Mom contributed her diaries, her scrapbooks, and her memories to my research. As I explored life on the home front during the war, I found myself just as fascinated as I was with life in the jungle. Girls in those days kept scrapbooks, and my mother gave me all of hers, 5 or 6 scrapbooks, each one 6 inches thick, and her diaries. I mean, honestly, I know everything my mother did every day for about a 5-year period. But of course, my research went beyond her scrapbooks and her memories, and it really was a fascinating period, again, on the home front as well as overseas. World War II ushered in a period of great social change, as wars often do. For starters, the mobilization effort pulled the country out of the Depression at last. You know, we built 325,000 airplanes, 88,000 tanks, and 1,400 warships in just a few years. I mean, that'll pump up your economy. Then you had 12 million men, mostly men, in uniform, which meant that a big portion of that generation traveled all around the world. That was a big deal. Today, everybody's a globetrotter, especially the young people. But in the 1930s, no one ever expected to travel abroad. People hardly traveled out of state. So that had a big impact on that generation. Another big change was integration of the armed forces, which grew out of the war effort and took place in the years immediately following the war. And finally, although no one suspected it at the time, Asking women to take the jobs of the men who were going overseas led to a permanent change in social attitudes. It's hard to believe this, but women were not allowed in the government jobs in Washington before the war. And of course, women largely did not work and might teach school for a year or two, but then they got married and stayed home with their families. So the powers that be had to launch a publicity campaign to assure young women and their parents that it was not only okay for them to go to work, but it was an important contribution to the war effort. Of course, the men who created that publicity campaign agreed among themselves that after the war, the men would come home to their jobs and the women would go back to the kitchen. And we all know how that worked out. My mother was one of those who benefited from this change in attitudes. After she and Dad broke their engagement, she went to Washington to work in the war effort, where she met and dated many Army and Navy officers. She worked for the Lend-Lease program. It's hard for young people today to imagine, but in the 1930s and 40s, no one went steady until they were engaged or married. A date was a casual thing, and it was expected that girls and boys would go out with lots of different people. There was this idea that you dated lots of boys and men until you found a good husband, then you got married. For young women of that era, their social life was their job. Plus, it was fun. During the war, even as women went to work and liked it, marriage was still the eventual goal. But the country was in such flux, with young men joining the service and moving around the country, and young women going to work, often away from their hometown, and meeting lots of new people. Weddings became the growth industry of the country at the time, along with building munitions. In 1942, 1.8 million couples got married, up from 1.4 million just before the war. In my mother's memories of wartime, two things stand out about the mood of the country. One was the unity of purpose, and two, the uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. It was very much live for the moment. Mom said everywhere you went, you could sense that people felt we are all in this together, and they would help each other in spontaneous ways. But there was also the pervasive cloud of fear hanging over the country. When will this be over? Who will be taken next? And who will win? Of course, we know today how the war came out, but in 1942, and even 43 and 44, there was a great deal of uncertainty about what would happen. America had disarmed 20 years earlier at the end of World War I. It's hard to believe how unprepared the country was for a world war. My father was in the class of 1939 at Clemson, and that class, nationwide, the military, the ROTC programs, that class provided the bulk of the field officers for the war. When Dad got out of college, he was in the Army and drilling troops at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, and they were using wooden sticks for rifles. They didn't have enough rifles. Dad was buying ammunition out of his own pocket to practice on the firing range. Later, in 1941, he participated in the big War Games exercise in Louisiana. And he said the Army hired people with private planes, like little Piper Cubs, to fly over and throw bags of flour out of the cockpit to simulate bombs. That's how unprepared we were. Dad said that he thought at the time, I hope this pitiful army never has to take the field. So, of course, people were very worried about what would happen. In such a stressful and uncertain environment, the prevalent attitude was live for the day. People crammed a lot of social activity in their lives in a sort of frenetic way. Dancing to big band music became the escape, the energetic way to take our minds off the fear and uncertainty. One of the fascinating things for me about the World War II era is how glamorous much of the social life was. You know, there's none of this jeans and popcorn at the movies, although, of course, everybody went to the movies. The movies provided another escape, and a very glamorous one. If you go back and check out some of those old movies from the late 30s and the 40s, they're all very similar. The plot is always the same. It's a Cinderella story, and some poor girl from a small town has gone to the big city to try to make her fortune, and she's always destitute and living in some apartment with no heat, and but she somehow also manages to have this exceedingly glamorous, gorgeous wardrobe. So those movies are a fun escape. But dancing was the rage. Swing dancing, the big bands played everywhere, from roadhouses to hotel ballrooms, and sometimes 4 or 5 nights a week. It wasn't just Saturday night, and people dressed up. It's not too hard to imagine dressing up for a formal dance at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington. But even when my mother was in high school and going to dances, she said the girls dressed up in cocktail dresses and often in long gowns, and the young men wore tuxedos. All the colleges held 2 or 3 big formal dance weekends each year, featuring national acts like Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, Duke Ellington. Last year, as I was helping my mother pack to move to assisted living, I found a small chest that had in a drawer 37 pairs of gloves. 37. Mostly leather or kid, but really every fabric and color. And there were three pairs of gorgeous elbow-length kid gloves. Imagine having a social life so busy that you needed multiple pairs of elbow-length gloves. World War II was the biggest event of my parents' generation. And like many young women, my mother spent those years being fussed over by men in uniform. And of course, a uniform automatically makes a man look handsome and dashing. While a lot of women, like Mom, had jobs during the war, young women also contributed to the war effort just by being, in some measure, the ideal of wholesome American womanhood that the men were fighting for. You didn't have to be a pinup girl like Rita Hayworth to inspire the troops and help maintain the morale of the fighting men. Young men were fighting for the ideals of freedom, yes, of course, but on a very elemental level, they were fighting to go home to their wives and girlfriends. That's why so many of them proposed just as they were getting on a troop ship. It became a patriotic duty for my mother and her generation to write letters to men overseas. There were organized campaigns to connect young women by mail with soldiers and sailors far from home. Not surprisingly, many girls married the men they formed relationships with by mail. My mother corresponded with at least a dozen men, including eventually my father. But think about that. Imagine how challenging it must have been for my dad and soldiers everywhere to conduct a courtship when it often took a letter 3 weeks to be delivered and 3 more weeks for the answer. Do you still love me? There's a famous scene in the movie American Sniper where Chris Kyle, the sniper, played by that darling Bradley Cooper, is in his sniper position in Iraq, and he's talking on a cell phone to his wife. There were no such luxuries in World War II. No telephone, no email, no Facebook, and you're gone for 2 or 3 years. Dad sent Mom a bracelet from India in the fall of 1943 that did not arrive until the spring of 1944. Despite all these and many other challenges to their courtship, Flo and Bo somehow ended up together. But not until they had both examined every other possible choice first, and not until they had both dodged a lot of bullets and traveled a circuitous route of dance floors and global airfields. This book is a memoir of a relationship that unfolded at a certain time in history. It's also a look at the era, what it was like to live through World War II if you were a young American. After all, Flo and Bo's love story cannot be separated from the great global conflict they shared. Their courtship would not have unfolded as it did had they not met at the precise moment of America's entrance into the war. 6 months earlier, or a couple of months later, their story would not be worth telling. The war brought them together, and the war kept them apart. The war dictated how they communicated and what they did during the years that they were separated. And the war made both of them stronger. Not only did wartime events impact the course of their romance, the wartime environment imprinted both of them with memories of the most exciting and romantic time in their lives. They fell in love against the stimulating and patriotic backdrop of war bond rallies, troop trains, a revving economy, and frenetic big band music. The world and society both opened up during the war, affording the young men and women of that generation wildly unexpected experiences. My father left a backwater village in the South and traveled around the world. My mother lived the circumscribed life of a small town Southern girl and went to work in a big city. It was romantic and exciting to do one's part to save the world for freedom, and afterwards to rejoice together in homecomings and victory. For America, it was the last romantic war.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was excellent to hear. I'm curious though, do you have like a excerpt of your book that you'd like to read or share with us? Maybe a particular passage or a couple pages that really stand out to you. It sums up your parents' relationship with this whole time period.
Yes, I have. Let's see, different ones that I read from time to time. Let me read this one where Dad's in the jungle. I have to tell our listeners here that in writing this book, a lot of it is Dad telling his story, Mom telling her story. And since, as I noted earlier, we 3 children heard these stories hundreds of times. Of course, when we were children, we were spellbound. But the older we got, the more we listened to the stories, we started kind of bantering with Daddy as he told the story. And I've included some of that in the book, where the peanut gallery, the 3 of us children, throw in comments to what he's saying. In this scene, Dad is in the jungle in Burma. And he's describing his situation there. He said, this is Dad talking. I had a radio team with the regiment, and I had one with each of the 3 battalions. There was a 3 or 4 man team with each battalion. They had the old time World War I generator, which was a box about 6 or 8 inches square. You'd sit here with a tripod and crank the generator, and this fellow over here with the key would be trying to get a message through. The radio teams were American. I had a Navajo Indian for a while. Merrill's Marauders used them a lot. They could transmit messages in the clear during a battle because the Japanese couldn't understand them. They never did break that code. Dad's team at regimental headquarters was led by a man named Foreman. He and his 3 teammates had joined the Signal Corps in Washington. According to Dad, Foreman laughed and said, "We thought we were going to stay in Washington for the duration, but they packed us up and sent us over here in the jungle." From time to time, Dad would go to the divisional headquarters, which was usually set up a mile or so behind the front, but might be as much as 5 miles back through the jungle. The dense vegetation hid wild animals, enemy patrols, and snipers who could pass within a few yards without being detected. So travel between camps was never without risk. Depending on where they were, Dad walked or rode his horse. He would relay requests for supply drops for the regiment, pick up orders for advancing, get the news of other units operating in the region, and somehow send messages to have orchids and bracelets and scarves delivered to Mom. On one such visit to headquarters, Colonel Smith assigned Dad a lieutenant named Trossel. Dad was with the 66th Regiment. They were in an area of active enemy patrols and snipers, and Dad elected to wait until the next day to return to his unit with Trossel. At that time, there was a supply unit, a group of Chinese barrows with an armed escort carrying provisions to the regiment, and the 2 officers could travel in the relative safety of a group. In the meantime, Dad learned several interesting things about his new lieutenant. 1, Trossel had brought into the jungle an emblem of American civilization, a bag of M&Ms. Chocolate. Chocolate was hard to come by in the jungle because it didn't keep in the heat. Dad loved chocolate, and Mom even sent him a box of chocolate pudding mix one time, which of course was useless. So he envied Trossel his M&Ms. 2, Trossel had some specialized skill for this assignment. According to Dad, he had been sent to the Berlitz school and he spoke Chinese. The only thing was he spoke Chinese too well. He spoke proper Mandarin, not this coolie talk, you know. The coolies had a vocabulary of a few hundred words and they'd just roll them around any kind of way. But Trossel didn't last long, 24, maybe 48 hours. Killed? The peanut gallery asked breathlessly. No, he got his toe shot off. The armed guard and the Chinese with their jimmy sticks with a basket on either end, led off down the narrow path, and the 2 officers followed. A few miles out, they were ambushed. As snipers opened fire, Dad rolled over behind a log, and Trossel jumped into an old foxhole. They returned fire, but in the melee, Dad heard Trossel groan and knew he had been hit. As the snipers were driven off, Dad scrambled to Trossel's side and saw his boot was a bloody mess. A piece of shrapnel had taken off part of his boot and one of his toes. Dad pulled out the first aid pack they all carried, opened the dressing pre-treated with antiseptic powder, and put it on the wound. The detail backtracked to headquarters, carrying Trossel on a stretcher. Trossel's war was over. He would be shipped back to the States. Having done his duty to his brother in arms, Dad turned his attention to one last detail. Leaning over the wounded man on the stretcher, Dad said, "All right now, Lieutenant, you've got a ticket home. But you've got that bag of M&Ms, and you can't take those with you. They stay here." So Dad relieved him of his bag of M&Ms. Sometimes it's the little things that get you through the hard times.
That's fantastic. If I don't know if you had another excerpt that you wanted to read, or if you're ready to go into questions.
Let's see, if you think our time permits, I can read a little bit about something about my mom.
Oh no, that'd be fantastic. That'd be a nice way to bookend the whole thing.
Okay, let's see. This is, okay, Mom is working in Washington for Lend-Lease. In the spring of 1943, Mom was feeling about as good as a girl could feel, given that the number one man in her life was overseas. Dad had written to repair the rift, which gave her the upper hand, on top of which she had plenty of men to take her dancing while she and Dad sorted things out. But nothing stays the same in wartime. The Pentagon decided to reassign her brother Dick's unit to Fort Benning. Benning was, at the time, turning out a class of second lieutenants every week, officers who had been trained on an accelerated program, the so-called 90 Days Wonders. My mother's brother Dick was in Washington at Fort Myer, and had helped her find a place to stay and a job when she went there. Dick left for Georgia with his unit after asking Mom to drive his new bride, Pat, south in his car. My grandfather, Pop, contributed some gas ration tickets and a ticket permitting them to purchase 2 tires. And on April 26th, they set off. Mom managed to get a couple of days off from work for the drive and the return trip by train. The sight of Fort Benning flooded her with memories, fond memories, now that she and Dad were corresponding. As they drove around the post, Mom showed Pat significant historical and romantic points of interest, happily reliving the heady days of the year before. Pat must have been curious that Mom lingered in the parking lot of the officers' club. "You cute little thing, you're just about what I've been looking for. What do you think about us getting married?" she recalled. 2 weeks later, shortly after her 19th birthday, Mom told her boss at Lend-Lease that she was leaving. John Miles, chief of the statistics branch, immediately wrote Pop, letting him know how valuable Flo was, in the obvious hope that her father would encourage her to stay. Miles included a copy of Mom's excellent fitness report and wrote in part, "Your daughter ably fills the position she holds and does work of a type where replacements are very difficult to procure. She is engaged in confidential statistical work necessary to the successful operations of one of the most important war agencies, and should she leave, we would feel it a considerable loss." But Mom had made up her mind. The visit to Fort Benning almost certainly played a part in her decision. For one thing, Dick's departure from Washington limited her access to the officers' club at Fort Myer. Many of the men she knew had shipped out, and social life in Washington had slowed down. In addition, June week at the Naval Academy was approaching, and the graduation festivities would include a final celebration with many of her friends, a last chance to hug the boys who had suddenly become the men who had to save the country. Plus, Dick and Pat had invited her to visit them at Fort Benning. Lounging around the pool, even in Georgia, sounded more appealing than working in a sweltering office through the hot, humid Washington summer. As much as she would miss her girlfriends in the office, she was ready for a new situation. Famous among Mom's girlfriends was Shirley, whose sad tale Mom recounted dozens of times as an object lesson to me. Shirley's fiance, Bob, was overseas, and Shirley had practically withdrawn into a convent as she waited for his return. After 2 years of twisting the engagement ring on her finger and waiting faithfully, Shirley was devastated to learn Bob had dumped her for another girl. Mom was torn between sympathy for Shirley's pain and annoyance that the girl had so foolishly put her life on hold for 2 years. The girls had all lost men they knew in the war. As my mother said, it was a sad reality that the man you loved might not come home. And even if he did, he might not come home to you, Mom frequently said. As much as Mom wanted to give herself over to the pleasure of being in love with Beau, Shirley's story was a fresh reminder of the risks, and she held back a piece of her heart. Mom went to June week at Annapolis with Julian J. Arnold and danced and flirted with the class of 44, graduating a year early under the War Department's accelerated program for producing officers. The class of 43 had already graduated in January, 6 months early. The celebration took on a bittersweet, frenzied feel. She knew so many boys in the graduating class. With war raging all over the globe and the outcome still in doubt, the thought hung over the young men and women that many of them would never see each other again. Many of the dashing midshipmen in their crisp white uniforms would never come home. And which ones would they be? Mom wanted to hold on to every one of her friends. I saw everybody really and got a real good rush of attention from different men, surprisingly enough, she wrote next to a suppressed corsage. Though I had a program, we didn't bother to keep any of the dances. Don Wyckoff, another one of her beaux, kept watch on me, the old cutie. After graduation, the lovelorn J. Arnold followed Mom to Washington to propose. But by now she had a well-rehearsed response to marriage proposals. She gave him a flattering non-answer, leaning heavily on the war and the military prohibition against marriage for 2 years following graduation. 3 days later, she taped the party scraps from June week onto the last page of her 1942-1943 scrapbook. Her final comment reflected the tumult of the previous 14 months, as well as the often contradictory mix of emotions the war created. So ends another year. It started with one tall, dark man and ended with another. Oh well, c'est la guerre, and am I sick of it? Although I've gone more places than ever before because of it and met more cute men. I only hope next year is as happy and successful as this has been, and that my many scattered friends are safe. June 12, 1943. It had been an emotion-packed 12 months. Mom wasn't exactly jaded, but she thought she had learned the rhythm of wartime. But nothing stays the same in war.
Or rather than c'est la vie, c'est la guerre.
Yeah. Yeah.
We do have quite a few questions from our audience, Robin, if you don't mind getting into those real quick.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's see, let me bring up my screen here with all the questions. The first one, how did your father get assigned to the Chinese theater of war? Was it something that he had asked for, or was that something that was predetermined while he was going through his training?
My dad was a wonderful adventurer. He always looked for exciting new things to do. And when he, after he and mom had their rift, he knew he was going to have to go overseas. And he began looking for what assignments might suit him. He had a general who was kind of a mentor who said he would see that dad got whatever assignment he wanted. And he found this assignment, this request from Stilwell for 12 officers, 10 officers who were experts in weaponry and spoke Chinese. Well, dad was an expert in weaponry, but he certainly didn't speak Chinese. Nevertheless, he told General Bull that that was what he wanted. And General Bull said, don't worry about that. There are a million interpreters over there. If it's what you want, I'll see that you get it. So that's how he got it.
The second question. Get it to advance. Here we go. Do you have any of your father's letters from this time, or do all your recollections come from his retelling of the stories to you and your siblings?
That is really interesting. I have a handful of letters that he wrote to his parents. I don't have any letters that he wrote to my mother, which it seems very strange. I mean, mom said, I've got them somewhere, and my mom saved everything. But we never could find the letters dad wrote to her. And he didn't have the letters she wrote to him because just before he came home, all of his belongings were burned up, where they were stored in a fire. So I did get a lot out of the 7 or 8 letters that somehow I've got, I guess, in his mother's effects after she died. She had saved the letters and they were handed down to me. And I quote extensively from some of those letters in the book.
Okay. The next question, Robin. What type of work did your mother do for the Lend-Lease program?
She said she had to keep track of what material was going to different allies. The Lend-Lease program, of course, as I'm sure your listeners know, was started before America entered the war, and it was a way for us to provide supplies to Great Britain and France until they got run over, and also to China. So she was keeping track of how many tanks and sea rations and whatever were being sent different places. I don't have any more detail than that.
So it's kind of like a bean counter, but on a very, very grand scale.
I guess so. Wow. She said she didn't seem to think what she did was such a big deal, but I know everybody's contribution was important.
Yeah, and that's one of the phrases that you hear a lot from the World War II generation is just like your father said. I didn't do much. I wasn't a hero, but every little contributing piece really put the war effort where it needed to go. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
The next question, Robin. Do you think that working in those non-traditional roles that your mother did after your father had been stationed overseas, do you think this changed her ideals or thoughts on traditional roles of men and women during the time, or at least afterwards?
My mother was a very interesting woman. And remember, she was born in 1924. And she always felt very strongly that the most important thing that she did in her life was to be a good wife and partner and a good mother to the three of us children. And yet she had a very impressive public life. My mother was the first woman in Virginia to be nominated by either party to run for Congress. And she served, excuse me, she was elected statewide to serve on the Republican National Committee for 4 terms, that's 16 years, and was on the executive committee of the Republican National Committee. She also had a job for a while as a personnel agent. She went in to apply for the job as the receptionist, and my father said, "Oh, for goodness sakes, don't be that. Go be an agent, and you will be very good at that, and you'll make a lot of money," which she did. She was the leading agent in the agency. But she worked from the kitchen table on the telephone because she always put her family first, and yet she accomplished really quite a lot, particularly for a woman of her generation in the public arena. And she liked working. She enjoyed that.
Well, especially with the legislature. Wow, that's impressive. Do you have any of the things that your father collected while he was assigned overseas, Robin?
I do. I'm going to hold this up. Actually, I didn't have a way to display it, but this is a Japanese flag that was maybe I can put it over here. Yeah, a Japanese battle flag that came from Battle of Mangkwon, and the Chinese troops that my dad was embedded with presented this to him as a battle trophy. They gave him also gave him 2 samurai swords they had captured, and other artifacts like that. And as I said, when I speak in person, I bring a lot of these things. Bring my mother's scrapbooks and the things, dad's uniform and things he brought back.
Well, it's a shame that we can't have you live and in person here at the museum. It is great that we can have you from Virginia all the way here. And we do get to see some of the artifacts that your father had. Just a couple more questions here, I believe. Next one says, it sounds like your father had no problem speaking openly about his time overseas. Was just around the family, or was he that open about his experiences in World War II in general?
Oh, my dad was a storyteller, and he would tell whatever stories cycled up to the top of his brain at any moment to anybody who would listen. Of course, we were a captive audience, so we heard him a lot. But no, he was very open about all that. He doesn't talk about the horrors of war. And there is, and I had to sort of press him when I was working on the book, because he had never really told me about being in some of these battles. As he pointed out, he was a liaison officer. He wasn't an infantryman. So, he wasn't in the front line firing his carbine at the enemy. Nevertheless, he was under fire and fired in return on a number of occasions. So I did have to kind of pull those out of him. I mean, most of what he told were anecdotes about the millions of hours in between battles, which is a significant part of war, as anybody who's been there knows. But one of the responses I get a lot of times with my talk is that people say, "Oh, I'm so glad to read your book or hear these stories, because my father, my uncle, whoever, never talked about it. And I always, wanted to know what it was like."
Yeah, that's one of the common threads that you see amongst World War II veterans is their reluctance, I guess is a good word to use, to talk about some of their experiences. So it's nice to hear that your father, while he's not giving the gory details, he's still rather open about everything that he was doing, and he was happy to tell those, at least to his family, and like you said, other folks who would just listen as well. That's really important, I think.
Yeah, I do feel very fortunate to have these stories, and and to be able to share them, because so many people say, this helps fill in some gaps for me about my own father.
The next question, Robin. What did you see as the most challenging time or event that your parents had during the war?
Oh gosh. Well, I think for my dad, the most challenging thing was staying alive. He, even though he wasn't technically, right in the front line of battles, being in the jungle in Burma was extremely stressful, because they were just, in this thick jungle, and snipers were everywhere. You couldn't see 10 feet. You could pass, right next to the enemy and not even know he was there. You couldn't, Dad was a smoker. He smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. But he couldn't smoke at night, because you didn't want the burning tip to show the sniper where you were. So to keep up that constant feeling of being on alert was extremely stressful. And Dad said, when he got home from overseas, of course, he was just like straight out of the jungle and back home. Well, it took him 30 days to travel and get home, but he went to, where'd he go? Anyway, to check in, and spent the night in the BOQ somewhere, and he heard a noise and leaped up, and in the dark with his pistol, a loaded pistol, by his bed, and took him a few minutes to realize, oh, I'm back in the States, it's okay. And so he said that he unloaded his pistol and thereafter kept it in the bottom of his bag, because he was afraid what might happen. So I think that stress was the biggest challenge for him.
Yeah, it's probably a good thing he unloaded that pistol.
Yeah.
Being back home and, a car backfiring, or somebody closing a door too hard, or something like that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, I'm sure for my mother, it was a challenge when they got married. They were married 10 days after he got home. So when they got married, they had seen each other probably fewer than a dozen times over a period of 3 years. And my mother was only 20 years old when they got married. She'd been through all this and was still, at that point, only 20 years old. So I think that was probably a big adjustment for her. It was a good thing she was a really strong person.
If I'm not mistaken, Robin, I think this is our next to last question here. Can you tell us a story about the runaway horses? You alluded to that in the beginning of the program, and I think you piqued some people's curiosity.
Oh, well, it's in the book in great detail, but Dad was a horseman and grew up with horses. My grandfather loved horses. And so when they were at the head of the Lido Road, preparing to go into Burma, and they were at the staging ground, of course, they brought in a lot of mules, but they brought in this herd of tough little Australian ponies, Daddy said. And he was intrigued. Oh gosh, this is something, normal life. And he went over and checked out the herd and picked out one of the ponies that, as he said, moved pretty well. And they somehow found him some tack, and he once in a while would go ride this pony. And in fact, he rode the pony all through the war, through the Burma Campaign. And at one point, they brought him he decided to go riding, they brought him the wrong horse. And he said, "This is not the right horse." And they went, "Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is." Of course, Dad was a horseman. He knew, he could tell them apart. He knew it wasn't the right horse, but what the heck. So he gets on this horse, and this horse is not broke. And the horse takes off with him and is terrified, running away, and runs through the parade ground where the Chinese are practicing driving tanks and trucks and so forth. And most of these Chinese had never even seen a mechanized vehicle 3 months earlier, and now they're driving a truck. And they knew, Dad said, that the Chinese drivers knew that if they were told follow that truck in front, they were going to follow that truck in front, because if they didn't, they might just get shot by their own superior officer. So he knew they weren't going to dodge out of the way when his horse ran through all the parade vehicles. And my dad's life was characterized by a lot of good luck. And this was one example. He made it through the parade and finally ran the horse into a tree to get him stopped and survived. But,
that is quite the story.
yeah.
You also seem to have a following. There is somebody in the audience who remembers you writing for the Times-Dispatch.
Oh, good.
They used to go to school in Richmond, and they remember reading your articles in the Times-Dispatch, and they were curious if you still write for that publication.
No, I haven't written for the Times-Dispatch in a long time, but that was certainly a great place to work. And I had the best job on the paper because I was a feature writer and I could write anything I wanted. I would just go out and find stories and fun stories and write about them. And I wrote about hang gliding was a new thing. So I went hang gliding and wrote about that, and went and drove a tractor and trailer and wrote about that. And so I had a great time, and a lot of my columns are collected in one of my books of essays. I have 2 books of essays. I'm a humor writer, really. So there's all my books, even the war book, have humor in them. But I have 2 books of essays, Chivalry, Thy Name is Bubba, and Bush Hogs and Other Swine. So, and they're mostly newspaper columns.
Last but not least, of course, Robin, if you can please remind us when your book was published, and more importantly, where can we get a copy?
The book came out November 15th, and it's available from, any bookstore can order it. My website is robinwilliamsbooks, plural.com. You can order through my website. You can get it from Amazon. And as I said, any bookstore can order it for you. But, if you order through my website, you can, we're getting ready to do a special of free shipping, if that's appealing.
That's always appealing.
Always appealing, right.
Well, Robin, it's been a real treat talking with you today and talking about your parents and your new book. Congratulations on that. And we definitely had a great time having you on today. And please, like I said earlier, if you're ever in the Madison area and get a chance to come by the museum, we'd love to see you here.
Well, thanks, Eric, so much. It's really been such a treat for me to be part of this program. And I would really love to come see your museum and meet all your fans.
It sounds like you have more fans than we do. And everybody who's joined us today, thank you very much for joining us for our book talk. We look forward to seeing you at some of our other virtual events. Coming up this week, we have trivia coming up tomorrow night. And then we also have our movie night discussion coming up on Friday night. So look forward to those. If you're a trivia or a movie fan, we'd really like to see you out there. Otherwise, take a look at our website, wisbetsmuseum.com. We have more curator conversations and book talks coming up in the future and continuing into 2022. I'm already putting our 2022 calendar together. So many, many more programs to come up. And once again, Robin, thank you very much. And for everybody out there in our audience, thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of the day. See you, everybody.